Reverend Michael Ellick is the minister of Judson Memorial Church. In his ministry, he has worked as an organizer, a social justice advocate for immigrant rights, marriage equality, single-payer health care, economic and environmental justice, and racial profiling. He was a very early supporter of Occupy Wall Street and is one of the founders of Occupy Faith in New York. Reverend Ellick is particularly interested in understanding the Christian passion story in an America threatened by falling empire and failing plutocracy. Raised in a conservative Baptist church in Washington State, Reverend Ellick studied comparative religion and philosophy at the University of Washington before earning his Master's of Divinity at Union Theological Seminary in 2000. Still hungry for new ways of understanding the gospel, as well as real-world practices for embodying its prophetic compassion, he studied closely under a Tibetan Buddhist teacher for the next 5 years. Over the course of his life, he has also worked as a courier, a fast food cook, a fact checker, a fresh juice delivery person, a copy editor, an event planner, a barista, a financial analyst, and even as an assistant at a marine biology lab. At Judson, Reverend Ellick has embraced Judson's legacy as a research and development laboratory for American Christianity. His exploration of new theological forms has grown out of his commitment to the social gospel in action and the practice of God's presence in silent prayer, reflection, and meditation. For his work around building a faith-based movement for economic justice, he is sought out as a consultant, strategizer, and advisor, both here in New York City and around the country. He currently lives in Greenwich Village. Let's give a warm welcome to Reverend Michael Ellick.
Well, it's good to be here. I love Cinco de Mayo, and for a lot of reasons, on the West Coast it has a very different meaning and purpose than how it kind of got marketed there later on, so it's good to be here with you this morning. I especially like being here because Bruce and I were talking before. If you were the minister of a church, the downside of it is that you have to actually be at that church every single Sunday. They frown on you not being there. So I don't get to go to all the many different faith communities that are around New York City, something I used to love to do before I was ordained at Judson. It's also a pleasure, especially to be at Community Church. Bruce and I and various members of this church have worked together on various social justice issues over the years, so it's an honor to be asked to come and preach here and to talk here and share some of what I'm about to say. I think David hit a lot of it. I probably have to just recycle a lot of what he said. Of course, this is Action for Justice Sunday, so I think they asked me to speak specifically on something with a social justice focus. I think I will not disappoint, I hope. But let us begin our time together with a brief moment of silent prayer. So today I want to talk to you about the single most dangerous passage in the entire Hebrew Bible. Ironically, this passage comes from the most boring book of the Bible. It is the third most boring book, right after Numbers and Leviticus, right before 1st and 2nd Chronicles. The book of Deuteronomy, I doubt many of you here have read it. It certainly does not get that much review. It's not a very exciting thing to pull out from your spiritual bookshelf. But here is a brief sneak peek as to what is going on inside Deuteronomy. In chapter 5, Moses, you all know who Moses is, right? Moses repeats the 10 commandments that he had brought down from the mountain. And then the rest of the book claims to be a kind of commentary upon those 10 Commandments. Fine, 10 Commandments, well and good, but what do they actually mean in our lives? This is what Deuteronomy is supposed to be doing. But when you actually read the book, what you discover is that Deuteronomy is largely a text that is about immigrants, widows, and orphans. Immigrants, widows, and orphans. Now, why is this? This is because, bluntly, immigrants, widows, and orphans were the economic bottom dwellers of the Hebrew community. They were the people who had no legal male advocates. And in this system, that meant they had no representation. They were without any economic resource. And so, in the book of Deuteronomy, the God of the Torah is telling the people, through Moses, that it is the special role of community to protect and look after all those people who have no other economic resources. According to the book of Deuteronomy, this is what a faithful community does. This is what a faithful community is. Without this, all you have is a bunch of people living in close proximity. But the whole definition of community is defined. Without this, we have nothing. So this is the book of Deuteronomy. It tells you how a spiritual community, or what the spiritual rules of community cohesion are supposed to be. Now, this is not an obscure book of the Bible. This is one of the first 5, part of the Torah, and supposedly the text is foundational to the entire, Judeo-Christian spiritual tradition. But if you read this text as a modern person, the contents of the book are actually sort of this amazing surprise. And you might catch yourself thinking, why is it that this stuff is never what gets repeated when people get on TV and talk about religion and all this and that? In a country that talks so much about our religious values and virtues, why isn't Deuteronomy a part of the conversation? Well, I guess we'll see why in a second. Biblical scholar Walter Brueggemann, excellent smart man, he describes Deuteronomy as a manifesto of economic justice. It presents a unique spirituality where the righteous person isn't one who meditates or repeats mantras or does yoga. Not that there's anything wrong with all these wonderful things. I think I do all 3. The righteous person, according to Deuteronomy, is one who serves the neighborhood, one who practices mercy toward the oppressed. After Exodus in the Bible, this becomes a unique kind, particularly Jewish teaching. A covenantal conviction that refuses to think of the gap between the haves and the have-nots as being a necessary given inside an economy. Jews who are faithful to the book of Deuteronomy cannot accept an economy that isn't working for the betterment of everyone inside their society. But the book goes much further than that. It says something in chapter 15 that is amazing, astonishing, and if we actually took seriously what comes out of our ancient traditions, it would even be revolutionary. It's already been read here this morning. Chapter 15:1 says that every 7 years, communities are supposed to cancel the debts on all the poor people. They called it the year of release, and I don't know about you, but this is nothing. I never heard this in the Sunday school where I grew up in Washington State. Somehow they glanced over this part. Actual debt forgiveness. This is not the proclamation of an anarchist or a socialist or even an occupier, although these days that is exactly what they're doing. This is sacred scripture, and for the moment it doesn't matter whether or not any of you here agree that we should forgive debts on poor people or not. The point is that if you are anyone claiming any kind of Judeo-Christian spirituality at all, you have to grapple with the fact that this is Moses in the Torah telling people that there should be no permanent underclass that is perpetually in debt. We are not a community. Our cities are not communities, not according to the Torah, not according to Moses, who we are in direct violation of. Now, the Jews were not unique in this regard. They were not the only people to do this. Almost every single society of the ancient world had some similar form of debt forgiveness. Rome was the exception, finally, and the reason why you always had to have some system of debt forgiveness is because people knew that debt, and especially making money from usury laws off debt, this is the way always. I was also an economist once. I don't know if that got said in there or not, but you learn pretty quickly that this is the way that money clogs up and concentrates inside a society. It happened again and again and again on a small scale, and so every society had some system of debt forgiveness until Rome comes along, and of course this becomes a history of empire. People knew that without a system of forgiveness, all the goods and resources of society would eventually drift into the hands of a privileged few people. And it's kind of a large-scale game of Monopoly, where only one person wins in the end and the rest of us go bankrupt. Now, fun fact, do you guys know that Monopoly, the board game, actually was designed as a critique tool for children about the evils of capitalism? Fun fact, because of course one person wins in the end, and everyone else has to lose. I don't think they can market it that way, a critique game of capitalism for kids! Exclamation mark. That's not the one that I have. But I'm wondering what the little symbols would look like if they changed that. So of course, analogies like this, post-Occupy, analogies like this are everywhere. They're part of our regular discourse. Economic disparity of our society demands it. And for most of us, if we don't own property, if we don't have a business or significant savings or something, all of us know paychecks equal survival. They are a matter of life and death. We are, a vast majority of us, wage slaves. And because the costs for basic things like housing and healthcare and education have all skyrocketed, even while jobs and resources have become harder to come by inside our society, one of the ways you ward off financial apocalypse is by going into debt. One of the ways you buy your way into the basic services of our society is by going into debt. I would be, my friends back home are crystal meth dealers now. Half of them are in jail. I got to come to New York City and go to a fancy Ivy League seminary. I get to stand here in front of you because I was willing to buy my freedom through debt. That's how it works, and I am not unique. And maybe it's a generational thing, but I guarantee you this is familiar as you go down younger and younger to anyone facing school, for example. Debt has become a way of life. And today, 77% of all American households exist in perpetual debt. Preeminent indebtedness is the main characteristic of our modern way of life inside this economy. And despite the hard wiring that we were all raised with, this isn't because people are irresponsible, it's not because they're lazy, it's because we have an economic system intentionally designed to produce winners and losers over time. A system specifically arranged without enough seats at the table. It would take a whole separate talk to talk about how the Fed works and how money is created by debt and who takes on risk and who doesn't. But you have to trust me, this is the way it works. It's designed, there are people who have to be poor. And maybe that'll be another talk. I'll come and bore you all with the PowerPoint presentation. Now, if your life, you're listening to me say all this, it's Sunday morning, and you're someone who has enough of a financial cushion around you, where none of this sounds familiar, that's great, and I'm serious, that's wonderful. But statistically speaking, we must recognize that this is not usually the case, and that the writing is actually on the wall for all of us. Ballooning debt is always a sign, an early warning sign that an economy within a closed system and a social way of life has grown too sick and too unsustainable to survive for very much longer in its current form. And today, economists on both sides of the political aisle all recognize that at last the generation has come that's going to have to deal with the real-world social consequences of the American way of life. Now, given this context, this is just news, right? We all know a lot of this. It's not a secret anymore. But given this social and economic context, the it becomes very suspicious to me that no one is talking about the book of Deuteronomy. Boring though it may be, it is not talked about by any of our religious leaders, and I actually spend my free time doing searches of these kinds of things. So the question I go around asking everywhere I go is, why are our houses of worship, and I think this one obviously is an exception, why are our houses of worship largely silent on issues of money, debt, and power? We live in a society where the Christian right justifies a hate war against homosexuals by citing two obscure passages out of context from the Bible, and then you hear nothing from these same so-called biblical literalists over the 17 explicit references against usury laws in the Bible. That's 17 references explicitly against lending money at an interest rate. This is the basis of the American economy, and yet not a peep by any of these guys. Somehow they have absolutely nothing to say on lending money at an interest rate. Something is going on. Where is that same moral outrage at predatory lending? Between Islam's explicit ban on usury and Buddhist and Hindu notions of eliminating karmic debt in all their material manifestations, where is the national conversation on money, debt, and power as necessarily spiritual issues? From a biblical perspective, debt forgiveness is far more than just an economic safeguard. It is actually a sacred teaching of the Torah. In the Torah, it functions like a spiritual antidote to the creeping notions of private property and self-sufficiency that inevitably enter the human mind and lead it astray. This is because, from a biblical perspective, we do not own the land, or the fruits of the land, or the materials that we build our buildings with. We are merely stewards, called upon to tend the land wisely and justly. From a biblical perspective, there's no such thing as private property. God alone owns the land and the stuff produced by it. God alone is the supplier and the sustainer. And so in this context, Deuteronomy's call for debt forgiveness becomes a gentle reminder of that larger existential reality in which we all live and breathe and humbly have our being. It's almost a connection to nature in its own way. Now, there are two things that this kind of teaching immediately does for us if we think about it inside a more modern context. I think the first thing it does is it changes the context entirely around those of us who have personal debt stories, and statistically that's like a lot of people. And it doesn't matter whether this is debt from credit cards, or student loans, or medical bills, that's a big one, or mortgage payments. Right now, our personal debt stories inside our society are, for the most part, shame stories. We are ashamed. They are hidden, secret narratives filled with dread and anxiety. In a culture shaped by the so-called prosperity gospel, all our debt stories are private, like some kind of unforgivable sin or something terrible that you've done to your family. Gotta keep it down, gotta keep it quiet. Never mind the fact that the system is designed to keep you in debt. Never mind the fact that all the banks go broke if all of us get out of debt. Somewhere in the back of all of our brains, there is an invisible policeman that says if you have a lot of money, God thinks you are a good creature. And if you don't have a lot of money and if you're in debt, God thinks that you are a bad creature. I still have these signals going on inside my brain from time to time. But from the perspective of Deuteronomy, the truth is, in fact, something else entirely. The truth is, our economy has evolved into a kind of global system of oppression, dedicated and designed to only help a very few people. This happens in a personal way with debt. In my work that I saw when I was in finance, we saw a much more global way of debt. You see it in how we go into third world countries and we offer them loans to modernize in the way that we think of how modernization should work. And when they cannot pay, the debt gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we strip mine all of their natural resources so they become dependent on us. This is a cycle that has outsourced slavery from the United States. all over the world. What we did here in this country is the tip of the iceberg to what we're doing consistently in the name of democracy and the free market all over this country. And I'm not some fringe person saying something that isn't immediately available inside the New York Times. This is economic fact. So the problem with this is that in our lives, we don't think about these things as being a system of oppression. We think about it personally, not politically. The problem is that the entire system, the reason we don't wake up and turn this thing off, is that the system has been designed to trick and assimilate us, to blame ourselves. It's already got its board-like probes and needles sticking inside our brains, whispering to us over and over again that all debt is personal and not political. That debt is economic, not spiritual. So how do we change this narrative? How do we get underneath this? How do we actuate social change in a very real way? How do you get underneath the deep hypnosis of the prosperity gospel? Well, if any of you guys have any ideas, please let me know. After the service, we'll put you to work for social justice. But one theory we have, and one thing that's happening this year, is that faith leaders and activists from around the country are calling for a national truth commission on debt. And because I am one of the founders of this truth commission, I would be remiss if I did not share it all with you. We're calling it a people's investigation of money, debt, and power. And the idea is to start getting, into phase one, all of these private debt stories and how they function in our lives, to get those things out in the open. To stop shielding it in ways as something hidden to be afraid of. We're looking for people who are willing to share their stories, and also we're looking for story collectors as well. So if you're interested in getting more involved, of course you can talk to me after the service, or at Judson. There's a website and all this, and I'm sure Bruce or some people will find a way to get in touch with me if you're interested. Because the whole idea is that horrible, sickly, empty feeling of being broke when there is enough to go around, that feeling of dread at just scraping by, that subtle horror of being crushed by debt or seeing someone else you know crushed by debt. According to the book of Deuteronomy, this is not a secular experience. This is a spiritual experience. It is the Holy Spirit reminding us that there is something wrong with this picture in this country. That there is, in fact, a kind of systemic harm that is being perpetuated against all of us. And whether or not we are the lender or the borrower, it's no good for our people or for this land. And that little angst we feel inside, that little pang within us that resists being a lifelong slave to oppression, we should all of us remember that this is the presence of the Holy Spirit inside us, reminding us that a better world is possible. So that's the first thing that I would want us to take away from our reflection on Deuteronomy. I want us to change the context of all our personal debt stories. But the other thing I want us to take away from thinking about the book of Deuteronomy is what it tells us about community. In the Torah, if you read it, Hebrew spirituality largely centers around how communities function. And more often than not, this is an economic discussion. And not only does it demand the forgiveness of debt, it goes even further than that. It suggests that our very identity as people of faith should be defined by a kind of radical, outrageous generosity, not only in our private lives and how we deal with one another, but in public debate, as engaged citizens, as advocates for a different kind of economic system. This is what the Bible suggests. If you're not just skimming through it and looking for the parts that allow you to bash people you don't like. There's a lot of great stuff in there in between, all the begats and all the lineages. This is what the Bible suggests directly, unequivocally, and it continues to astonish me that the so-called biblical literalists who dominate our national religious conversation can continue to evade this. Because the deep call for economic justice doesn't just appear in Deuteronomy or throughout the Torah. It stretches through all our ancient scriptures, all our ancient spiritual traditions, like an inconvenient truth that most of our faith communities seem dedicated to ignoring. For Christians, the baptismal practice of loving God and loving neighbor is necessarily a challenge to and a vision for different kinds of public policies, different kinds of corporations, and different kinds of churches. And for the moment, let's just think about that last one. Let's just think of all the churches in this town who took this as seriously as this one appears to. What if churches were always known as the most generous place in town, echoing Deuteronomy by giving away much more of itself because it actually had faith in God's gifts, faith in God's boundless generosity that we then had the privilege to mirror? This is the kind of faith that I tell my grandfather was a conservative Baptist minister, and when I would make these kinds of arguments to him, and he was, no, it's not good, I would remind him, he loved Paul, so I would remind him that this is the faith of Paul in 2 Corinthians, who reminds us to act like Jesus by emptying ourselves out in material and spirit, that we become poor, that we might make others rich. And of course, I know all of us recognize that this kind of giving of ourselves might very well look insane inside the modern American worldview. There's supposed to be this logic where we protect ourselves and this and that. But from a biblical perspective, this is the sanity that all of us have been looking for. Every time we turn on the TV or the radio or read the newspaper and think to ourselves, oh my God, the world has just gone so crazy. There is a different kind of sanity out there waiting for us. Our spiritual traditions clearly tell us that being a person of faith doesn't mean doing symbolic good deeds or even going to church or taking sacraments or anything else. Being a person of faith means always challenging yourself to getting right with the neighborhood by making real and fair community everywhere you go and with everyone you meet. And I propose to you that if all our faith communities are going to remain relevant and keep their footing inside the 21st century and beyond, it will be directly to the degree that we are always challenging the idea that economics are the study of scarce resources and there is not enough to go around, and countering that with the idea that economics is the study of abundant resources, that there is enough to go around, that serving neighbor and community does not take away from us, but rather that such things liberate us. My prayer for us today is this: that we not be spiritual doubters. We not just be content to put our toe into the water. Let us learn and risk how to be outrageous in our generosity. Let us learn to truly empty ourselves in spirit, that we may know firsthand what grace feels like. That we may become people who plunge firsthand, head first into the waters, and allow it to transform us. Let us become debt givers. And let us learn ourselves in the exchange how we may ourselves be